This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
3,300 years ago, somebody really wanted the ruler of Jerusalem to die. It's a curse inscription. We talk about that next on A View from the Bunker. Who would have thought just a few years ago we'd find ourselves in a world where refusing an experimental medicine could keep you from traveling, going to the store, or even cost you your job? Actually, we did. My novel, The God Conspiracy, was published last year when it suddenly became much more relevant than it had been when I started writing it more than 15 years ago. And I drew on characters and ideas developed by Sharon a few years earlier for her novel, The Armageddon Strain. We'd like to make The God Conspiracy available to you as part of our special offer during the month of August. It's a fast-moving story of people, ordinary people, who find themselves in circumstances beyond their control, and the only ones who really understand what's going on are those who see that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. During the month of August, we'll send you The God Conspiracy and 12 hours of video teachings. Our 2 DVD sets, Unmasking the Ancient Gods and This Is War. 4 discs in all, 12 hours of video teachings. A retail value altogether of $120 for just $35 plus shipping and handling. This offer is only available during the month of August and only at our store. Available online at gilberthouse.org. Cursed, you will surely die. Cursed, you will surely die. Governor of the city, you will surely die. Cursed, you will surely die. Cursed, you will surely die. Cursed, you will surely die. That's the translation of a text found at Jerusalem, dated to about 1300 BC. And it sounds funny today. It probably wasn't funny back then, especially if you were the ruler of the city. And there's some evidence to suggest that he was under a lot of stress. We'll talk about that with our guest this week. We're happy to have him back because this is his area of expertise, ancient epigraphy, especially where the early Hebrews are concerned. He's the author of a couple of books that we highly recommend, The World's Oldest Alphabet and Origins of the Hebrews, about which we have spoken with him on this program. Most recently talked about his paper on the Lachish milk bowl ostracon, another example of early Hebrew writing dating to the period of the conquest of Canaan. It's our honor to welcome back to the program Dr. Doug Petrovich. Doug, welcome back. It's good to see you again. Another discovery that seems right in your wheelhouse.
Good to see you, Derek. Yes, and the inscriptions keep coming. Isn't it amazing?
It is remarkable. And we talked about this for a shorter segment for Sci Friday, so here we got a little more time to stretch out and speculate, talk a little bit more about the discovery itself. This limestone slab found at Jerusalem, inscribed with basically, it's like 6 lines repeating over and over. Cursed, you will surely die. Governor of the city, you will surely die. Cursed, you will surely die. This sounds a lot like the inscription found on Mount Ebal, which Professor Gershon Galil was also involved with. Now, he according to Haaretz, the article I'm reading, which is preceding his publication in an academic journal, he's quoted as describing this as proto-Canaanite, which was not the conclusion that he reached on the Mount Ebal inscription. I'm curious, what's the difference between the two, or is there any?
Yeah, and that goes back to what I would consider to be a fallacy, because going back 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years in time, when inscriptions were found that were alphabetic inscriptions, and they were found in the land of Canaan, which of course was occupied before the Israelites arrived, in the year that I consider to be 1406 BC, at least as a nation, as a people. I mean, obviously Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were there much earlier, but that long period of time between Jacob's departure in 1876 from Canaan and the arrival in 1406, the area is occupied by Canaanites, by Jebusites, by Amorites, all kinds of, Canaanite-related people who, many of them died off in antiquity. But for some reason, those inscriptions that have been found over these last number of decades are just automatically chalked up to the Canaanites, as if they're the ones who invented the script. But every sign we have of the actual invention of this script, it has nothing to do with Canaan, not at all. The earliest inscriptions are all found in two places, Egypt and Sinai. And of course, Sinai is Egyptian territory in the ancient world in the second millennium BC. So that's where the script derives. So to call it a proto-Canaanite script suggests to the person hearing that either it means that the language and script derives in Canaan or that the people behind it are from Canaan. But neither is true. They're not Canaanites, and it doesn't derive from Canaan. So why even use the term? For this script, we should be using something else. Proto-alphabetic script, proto-consonantal script, whatever your choice is. But of course, for me, and you know this is connected to the books that I've published, this is Hebrew, and it goes back to as early as 1842 BC when we have the first alphabetic letter inscribed on a mostly otherwise Egyptian inscription, a caption in Sinai 115 that has a clearly distinctive B letter, a B sound that it makes. And so that's the beginning of this alphabetic script that then perpetuates in Egypt and in Sinai until the middle of the 15th century BC. And who else is behind that? Nobody but the Hebrews.
So, yeah, just not to put too fine a point on it, of course, the world's oldest alphabet and origins of the Hebrews, you delve into this in real depth. Is it, I don't want to, put you in the position if I had to speculate on the motives of other scholars, but is it just that they have not yet recognized that connection that they're still calling this proto-Canaanite?
Yeah, it's funny, Derek. You mentioned Gershon Galil. He's connected, he's the brains behind the translation of the Ebal inscription for sure, and he's the one who's put out the translation for this inscription, this New Jerusalem inscription. He and I were wonderful friends, and we were talking about doing co-authoring journal articles on inscriptions, and I was very excited about this because I knew he had not only the pedigree but the skill and the knowledge, and he could complement what I would bring to the table. In fact, he was a much more established scholar and epigrapher than I was. And then all of a sudden, when my book published in 2026, connecting the original alphabetic script to Hebrew people, wow, all of a sudden, he didn't want to do anything with me. Why? Because I was considered a black sheep in scholarship. Because no scholar, no legitimate ancient Near Eastern trained scholar with a PhD wants to connect himself or herself with a school of thought that says Israelites actually lived in Egypt in the first half of the second millennium BC. So I became somewhere along the lines of anathema among my fellow scholars. I lost friends, I lost relationships. Some of my fellow grad students from the University of Toronto, where I did my MA and my PhD, they didn't want to talk to me anymore. So, that's all part of it. And Gershon Galil doesn't want to be thrown into that den of lions with me. He saw what happened to me. He doesn't want to be thrown in there with me. So I think at the end of the day, in his heart of hearts, I'm convinced he himself knows that this is Hebrew. But I'm also convinced that he knows that if he goes public with that, it's curtains for his scholarly stature. So again, right or wrong, that's my perspective on it.
Yeah, we've seen similar things like this in other areas. For example, it was you were not allowed to suggest that blood vessels or soft tissue could be preserved for more than a few thousand years until suddenly a very well-respected paleontologist at the University of North Carolina, whose name escapes me, Mary something, published back in the mid-90s, said, hey, look, we've got a T-Rex leg bone with blood vessels in it, and we've even found the heme molecule. And, oh, look, there's soft tissue collagen's been preserved. And suddenly now we've miraculously discovered that you can preserve collagen for 65 million years because we know that... But anyone who dared suggest it before somebody of that stature published and said that, yes, you can find blood vessels in... Now they're finding them in dinosaurs all over the place. Blood vessels. Oh, hey, look. It's no one was brave enough to step forward and make that claim until one person did it, took the flack. Now, of course, they're still arguing for an evolutionary model and 65 million years of time. Nobody's actually said, wait a minute, well, maybe that's not 65 million years. Maybe it's only a few thousand, but it's, that's a whole nother story. Again, this sort of thing happens in academia. Sharon had a little experience with that when she began pursuing a PhD, which she gave up for an MRS, for which I'm eternally grateful. It is one of the reasons we appreciate your work, Doug, that you're willing to take this. The first one who sticks his head above the wall is the one who gets shot at. What conclusions can we draw about this tablet? I mean, why is this curse inscription from Jerusalem now? Why is this a significant find?
It's a significant find for a number of reasons. Number one, it corroborates other inscriptions that, if they're not contemporary, they're within 100 or 200 years of one another, such as the Lachish milk bowl ostracon, which we've talked about in a previous episode, and also the Mount Ebal inscription. And so now we're getting this steady stream of inscriptions that are all from the same time period, the conquest and post-conquest era. So they're corroborating with one another. That's part of the significance. Another part is the fact that Jerusalem is a city that, to find anything from this era in time, it's amazing, because that's a city that's been, if not continuously occupied, then at least it's been built and rebuilt and destroyed, built and destroyed and rebuilt, built and destroyed and rebuilt, etc. Time and again throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia. And therefore, the expectation to find an important inscription such as this in Jerusalem, it's almost non-existent. It's kind of like anything you get out of Jerusalem, you can squeeze out of it. It's just short of miraculous. And that's what this inscription is too. It's only because it was found in a secondary context that became the case. But what it does is, being that this, again, and if I have to be the only person on planet Earth to say this, that's okay. It's a Hebrew inscription. And it connects the Hebrews to the city of Jerusalem. Now, we know in the Bible, in Joshua's day, they're connected, aren't they? There's the overtaking of the city of Jerusalem under Joshua. Joshua chapter 11, I think it's recorded there, in the king list. And then in David's day, in 1002 BC, David takes possession of Jerusalem. And from that point forward, it's a possession of the Judites / Israelites, if you will, all the way down until the 587 attack by the Neo-Babylonians, and they're kicked out of the land. So it becomes Israelite possession during that time period. But we're talking about a window in time between those two events, when the Israelites didn't occupy the city. So to find an inscription that's written by Israelites, that's written to the king or ruler or governor of Jerusalem at the time, that gives us the ability to sink our teeth into that gap period in Jerusalem's history, when there's no Israelite connection otherwise. Well, here it is, somewhere around 1300 BC, maybe a little north of that, maybe a little south of that, but somewhere in that vicinity. That's the date for this inscription. So now we can fit this into the narrative to say, here we have archaeological / epigraphical evidence, epigraphical, of course, being an ancient inscription or writing, that connects people who are writing to the governor of Jerusalem, to the city itself and its ruler. So that is an extremely important connection that we now have, that we never even had before. Isn't that exciting?
It really is. We're looking at 75 years or thereabouts after the incursion, the first crossing of the Jordan River by, maybe a little after that, but 75 to 100 years after Joshua and the Israelites crossed the river, took Jericho, took Ai, set up the altar on Mount Ebal, took the Amorite city-state rulers from the north, Hatzor, and the coalition from the south, which included the king of Jerusalem. So here you've got just a couple generations later, what appears to be a Hebrew curse against whoever reoccupied and took control of that city again. Historically, how do we reconstruct that period? This would be early in the period of the Judges then. Why would Israel not have settled in the city and taken control of that city?
Sure, and they certainly could have. Once Joshua and his people conquered the city of Jerusalem, they could have taken it. They could have occupied it. And ultimately, Derek, the Bible doesn't tell us specifically. There's no smoking gun that says, and thus the Israelites after Joshua determined that they would not occupy the city, and it was for this, and this reason why they didn't. There's no text that tells us that. So we're left to theorize what could account for this. And I think let's look at what we do know and use that to kind of extrapolate forward and say, here's why they didn't take over the city and live there and occupy it. Here's why it wasn't occupied until David comes along in 1002 BC. The Israelites, after the Exodus, lived for 40 years in the desert. Wasn't their plan. That wasn't even the expectation, or they had no knowledge of it as they left Egypt, right? It was only because of their incessant complaining and griping against God and doubting of him and faithlessness and disobedience that God finally just wrings his hand of these people and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Your generation will die in the desert. And your heirs, your children and their children, they will go into the land, the promised land, but you won't, because of what you've done to me as a thanks for taking you out of Egypt to bring you into the land of milk and honey, right? So that being the case, they lived 40 years in the desert. How do you live in the desert? You don't build houses in the desert, Derek. Maybe in modern times you could get away with it, right? You could figure out how to do that with technology, but in the ancient world, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. You don't build houses in the desert. So they couldn't settle anywhere. They had to just keep moving, looking for water, looking for sustenance, looking for, the next assignment from God. And again, we're not given all the details of where God wants them to be every step along the way. It's just certain places we hear about. But that would create a lifestyle. What kind of lifestyle? Well, if you go back to my new book, Origins of Hebrews, one of the proofs that I try to give for this being, meaning Avaris in Egypt, being the place where Jacob settled and the Israelites primarily lived at Avaris for these 430 years, according to Exodus 11, Exodus 12, 40, and 41. At Avaris, they had everything they needed, of course, but they one of the clear indicators that these were Israelites is they had 4-room houses. 4-room houses, it's like a glove that only fits O.J. Simpson, right? This is the architectural model that the Israelites use once they're in the land of Canaan, and for generation after generation after generation. It's the 4-room house, which is a modification of the tripartite building, a 3-part building that actually had its origins in Mesopotamia. But at the time of the post-Babel dispersion, that technology moves all over the known world, including to the west, to the Levant, where the Canaanites are, and it was picked up and followed there, the 3-part building, the tripartite building. And then once Jacob and his family are in Egypt, we see they've made a modification to this. They've added an extra part or portion to the house and turned it into a 4-room house. And it's attested in Jacob's lifetime. It's attested 150 years later, and maybe 50 years later after that. 4-room houses, multiple 4-room houses in the site of Avaris. It's one of the many smoking guns, if you will, to tell us that these are Israelites who lived at Avaris. So, that being the case, they took with them, and this is now the thinking of Bryant Wood I'm adding in, and I agree with him. He's my archaeology mentor. The Israelites wouldn't have forgot about their 4-room house model that they used in Avaris in Egypt, right? It would have been here in the back of their mind. Mm-hmm. And according to Bryant Wood, they would have used that same model, not to build houses in the desert, but to make their tents in 4 divisions, right? And they would have the same purpose for those 4 divisions in their tents that they would have used in this semi-nomadic lifestyle. We can't prove that because, again, these are tents. They're folded up and carried with them when they leave that site, and just they move on to the next place with their tents. But the point is, after this 40-year gap, all of a sudden, once the Israelites are in the land, once they finally do start building houses, guess what kind of house they build?
It's the four-room
house. So these are the same people. Well, all of that to say, because they're not building houses where they're moving around in the desert for those 40 years, they're used now to this semi-nomadic lifestyle. We tend to continue to do what we're used to, don't we? Mm-hmm. It's habit. So by habit, the Israelites coming into the land decided, let's just keep moving around. It's going to be safe for us. We won't have enemies looking around, peering around the corner. If we build houses in a city and we make that city our city, we're going to get Canaanites and Jebusites and Amorites attacking us because we'll be sedentary and they'll always know where to look. And next thing you know, they'll come after us. So that's probably part of the motivation. But the bottom line is they followed the model that they were using, that they learned in the desert. It's good enough in the desert. It's good enough in Canaan. Let's keep on the move. Let's stay safe. Let's do what we've been doing and move right along. So that's why we don't have Jerusalem occupied.
The archaeological record shows then just a very gradual shift from, say, 1400 BC down to the time of the establishment of the monarchy, just a gradual urbanization of the Israelites?
Yeah, it's a gradual urbanization. We don't know exactly when it begins. That's the fascinating part, that maybe in our lifetime, Derek, we'll live long enough to find out that answer. So far, we don't have that answer. It's not 1350 BC. It's probably not 1300 BC. It's probably 1200 something BC. And again, I don't know what year, but at some point in the 13th century, probably we're starting to see the Israelites moving in and occupying cities. We're seeing more Hebrew inscriptions that are, again, wrongly called proto-Canaanite inscriptions in certain cities such as Lachish. That is the prime place for inscriptions. They're found all the way from the time of the conquest, periodically, down until the Israelite occupation. At various intervals, there's another proto-consonantal inscription and another. These are Hebrew. So all of this signs that the Hebrews are involved in a interaction with Canaanite and other people of the land from 1400 or 1406 BC all the way down until the time they're building cities and houses in their cities.
Who would have been the main occupants of Jerusalem then in the 14th century BC? Are we talking Amorites? The Haaretz article said Jebusite, but that really seems to fit the time of David a little bit later on. Would it have been an Amorite city at that point?
Well, yeah, and that's a good point. And I'm of the view that originally it was an Amorite city, and at some point it turns into a Jebusite city. In my mind, the best time for that to happen, Derek, is the destruction by Joshua, right? And again, destruction doesn't necessarily mean destruction, wiping out the city and everything in it, the walls and all the buildings and all the houses and so forth. But the overtaking of the city, killing of the king and the killing of the people, yes, that happens. City after city, Jerusalem is one of them. But the perfect timing for a transition between the Amorites and the Jebusites is that. So that possibly, if not probably, the destruction of the death, if you will, of the people of Jerusalem under Joshua was the end of the Amorite occupation. And then after that, when somebody moves back into the city, probably at that point it's Jebusites who move into that city. And they occupy the city all the way down until the time of David. For me, that makes very good sense. It fits the evidence, but the evidence, I have to say, the evidence doesn't demand that is true.
It's an interesting timeline. By the way, I'm looking a little distracted here. It's because I'm hearing rain on the roof, which, given the way we've been scorched here in the Ozarks the last couple of weeks, is a real blessing.
Good.
Yeah, don't think we're going to get as much as we really need, but at least it's something. The destruction under Joshua around 1400 BC, give or take. At the time of the Amarna letters, which is just a little bit after that, the ruler of Jerusalem, if I remember correctly, is named Abdi-Heba, which means son of Hebat, which was the chief female deity of the Hurrians. So is there, well, what's the connection between the Hurrians and the Jebusites?
Well,
can we, I guess the other question is, can we assume anything about the ethnicity of the ruler of Jerusalem just because he has what appears to be a Hurrian name or a name that connects him to a Hurrian deity?
Not necessarily. And you certainly have the opportunity for Hurrians to be living in the land already for a long time before this.
Right.
In fact, you go back to the first and second Asiatic campaigns of Amenhotep II, who in the 1450 to 1446 range, or 1453 to 1446 BC range, he's going into the lands of the southern Levant, southern Canaan, to Canaan, and to the northern Levant, and he's attacking peoples, and his main enemy at the time is the Hurrians.
Really?
So the Hurrians are one of the two superpowers in the world. Egypt is the other.
Right,
and they're fighting for control of the northern and southern Levant. This area becomes what we call in historical studies a buffer zone. So two greater powers exist to the north of this and to the southwest of this. But kind of the battlefield where they're having their skirmishes, it's not between them, it's on the battlefields of this buffer zone where there are weaker peoples who are living. So that gives credence for the idea that you'd have either an incursion of Hurrians, or you would have the opportunity for Hurrians to be pouring in to the Levant from the north, especially, Derek, especially in 1446, when Egypt's army dies in the Sea of Reeds, right?
Yes.
In that debacle that happens that we read about in the Bible. And all of a sudden now, the shift of the balance of power between the two superpowers puts them at the top, and Egypt not second, but kind of off the chart. So the Hurrians are now able to take full control of any part of the Levant they want. And so that's the green light for people, businessmen or warriors or whatever it is, to be moving from the Habur Triangle region or the Habur River region down into the Levant. And so that's easy cash pickings for them. They can control what they want because they have the power of the superpower of the Hurrians behind them from Mitanni. So that's the opportunity for lots of people to be coming into the Levant, including the southern Levant. So yeah, we can't rule out that this is a Jebusite city just because we have a Hurrian name of the ruler after the time period of Joshua's destruction.
This is fascinating to me. I was turned on to the Hurrians by Sharon, who stumbled across the work of the Buchalates at Tel Mozan, which is ancient Urkesh, a very important city to the Hurrians going back to the middle of the 4th millennium BC. And their discovery that the Hurrians apparently were the inheritors of the culture of the Kura Araxes civilization, the very unique pottery that they carried with them from the plains of Ararat to the outer ring around Mesopotamia and down into the Levant as early as mid-3rd millennium BC. And in the Bible, they show up as the Horites, and the kings from the east in Genesis 14 wind up doing battle with them somewhere in the vicinity of Mount Sinai. So they were around for a very long time. It was just that in the time of the Exodus, as you mentioned, Mitanni, one of the main superpowers, the Mitanni, the Hittites, and Egypt, the three main superpowers of the day, with Babylon sort of an also-ran part of the Kashite kingdom at the time. But
and Mozan was even overtaken by the first empire of the world under Sargon of Akkad. So the Akkadians came and conquered it. So they would have put their footprint on that culture that goes, as you were mentioning, goes back earlier to the east.
Right.
And so they would have essentially kind of given it that Mesopotamian urbanization flavor, and that, I think, helped them eventually to get to where they could rise high enough that they could become a major player. And then, boom, next thing you know, they're duking it out with the Egyptians for control of the entire ancient Near East.
But by the time of the Amarna letters, and I was right, it was Abdeheba, servant of Hebat, the chief female deity of the Hurrians, sending a letter to Akhenaten begging for help. Say to the king, my lord, message of Abdeheba, your servant, I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. And going on about, if this year there are archers, then the lands and the client kings will belong to my king, my lord. But if there are no archers, then the king will have neither lands nor Hatsanu. So he was begging for help against the Habiru.
Yep.
And I guess that leads to
Derek,
the big question.
We both know that the Habiru are known in Egypt as the Apiru, and that goes back to the Hebrew word that's used of Aber, right? So Aber, if you were to say that in a Mesopotamian tongue, would be Heber. So the progenitor of Abram, and of course when the Bible introduces, we've talked about this before, when the Bible introduces Abram, it calls him a Hebrew,
yes,
right? Which
right.
means the Hebrews predate the Jewish people, the Israelites. They predate them. Whoever the Hebrews are, they predate the Israelite people. Who is that? Who predates them? It's the descendants of Aber. So those descendants include, but are not limited to, Abram. Abram's just one of the many Habiru, Hebrew, Apiru, etc. But he's one that becomes extremely important on the pages of biblical history. But the fact that he derives from them gives us reason to understand why these are called Habiru people. These are the same as the Hebrews. The king of Jerusalem is screaming out, Pharaoh, send me archers. We need to be able to defend ourselves against these attackers, these Hebrew attackers, because they keep coming at us. Year after year, wave after wave, attack after attack. We need help. So that very historical precedent, Derek, that gives us, I think, all the more reason to understand and interpret this new inscription from Jerusalem as being one that's connected to Hebrew attackers. It wasn't fellow Jebusites attacking a Jebusite city or attempting to curse against it. It's the same people attacking the city called the Habiru, who are the same people who are writing this curse tablet, like they write at Mount Ebal, where they mention their God, Yahweh, he who is, the one who goes on existing, right? It's all one people behind this, and they are bothering and annoying and harassing the Canaanite and Jebusite and Amorite people until they overcome them completely.
And I'm looking at Wikipedia, so this is not by any stretch real scholarship here, although I can't vouch for the citations. This letter from Abdeheba is dated to about the time of Amenhotep III, the son of Amenhotep II. It was the pharaoh of the Exodus, correct?
Well,
or is he two generations?
The son of Amenhotep II, who sat on the throne, was Thutmose IV.
Right. Okay. So this is a little bit later than that, roughly contemporaneous with the curse.
Yeah. And again, we don't know exactly when the curse tablet dates because it was not found in a in situ, what's called in situ archaeological context. So yeah, they're all from that same vicinity of time. I'm guessing, I could be wrong. It's kind of a toss-up between the Mount Ebal inscription, which is older, that, or the Lachish Milkbowl Ostracon. It could be one, it could be the other. You can make an argument either way, to be honest. But then probably this inscription is a hair later. This is several decades later, up to a century later, something like that. But yeah, it's all that same context, that same time frame.
I've done a bunch of reading on David Rohl, and I found his insights really interesting. I've since come to disagree with some of his conclusions about the timeline, but his speculation on the identity of Labayu, who is mentioned in this inscription, this is EA 287, the official designation for the Amarna text that we're referring to, and this ruler of Jerusalem is mentioned in like 5 or 6 others that have been found among the Amarna letters. Labayu, who is along with Milkilu, appear to be rulers of the Epiru that are rampaging through the land. Do you have any thoughts on who those characters might be?
So you're saying that David Rohl is connecting the king of Jerusalem to a person?
He thought Labayu was Saul, and that Milkilu was one of his, perhaps Malchishua. Okay.
Yeah.
Now the timeline doesn't work. It's off by several centuries, and that's why I don't want to get into let's bash David Rohl. I appreciate the fact that he's willing to think out of the box and take flack for his new timeline, which the Egyptian chronology sorely needs. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on some of these Epiru who are named in the Amarna letters, like Labayu and Milkilu, and there are probably others. I've not done a lot of deep reading on the Amarna letters, but just seeing that name Labayu and remembering David Rohl's speculation, which most scholars disagree with. And again, I have come to disagree with it too, because it just doesn't fit the timeline. It's like 300 years too early for Saul. But any thoughts as to who these characters might have been among the Hebrews?
I don't think so. And I think we're in a time period where we're only getting very occasional blips on the radar screen chronologically, down the timeline forward. So there aren't many kings that are named. And it's funny because Moses uses the same historiographical technique that the Egyptian scribes used of that same time period, which was you don't name the enemy kings of your people in your historical documents. You don't call them by name. Maybe you can call them by a more generic term, which the equivalent in Egypt, of course, is Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh is a designation for the person who rules Egypt. It comes from a word which means the great house.
Mm-hmm.
And that being the case, it eventually connects the concept of the house itself with the person who oversees that house. So it's the king of the house, right? And so there are those kinds of terms that Moses will use, like what we know of as Abimelech. That's not a name. That's a dynastic title. That's the equivalent of Pharaoh in Egypt.
Right.
Okay. So he'll use dynastic titles, but not names of people for the kings. Very Egyptian concept. Why? He was born and raised in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
He just followed the historiographical technique by not writing the name of the people. So this is why we have such a blank slate, and we're unable to connect names of the people, of the kings and rulers that Joshua and the Israelites conquered and were subsequently conquered by the later Israelites. We don't get that picture. We don't get the names to come with them. So we're kind of left in a quandary then when we see in the Amarna letters names for the kings and rulers of various cities within Canaan. So we're kind of stuck. We don't get to connect those dots. And yeah, it's a dangerous game when we're all of a sudden trying to make non-linguistic connections between certain rulers in the Amarna letters with biblical kings. That's really a dangerous game. So yeah, at the end of the day, we can't really do much connection with individual kings and rulers.
Fascinating to speculate, though.
Yep.
Where will this... Now, as I understand it, this text that Professor Gershon has translated was found about 10 years ago. Is it possible? I mean, how likely is it that there are other texts out there just waiting to be retranslated?
Great question, and it's absolutely possible. Well, look at the very important publication that many people don't know about. That goes back to 2010, published in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections by Peter van der Veen and about, I don't know how many, 3, 4, 5, 6 other people, on an inscription that had been sitting in the Berlin Museum for, I don't know how long it was, 100 years or more maybe, but certainly many decades, right? Way over 50 years. And sitting in Jerusalem, in Berlin's museum. And they came upon it and realized, oh my, this is an inscription that names Israelites as conquered peoples by the Egyptians. And then there was an article that came out 2 years later in a German journal, Biblische Notizen, which means biblical notes. And it was, of course, written in German. And for that reason, many Western English-speaking scholars don't know about it. But one of those scholars who was part of that original publication of 2010, he was the epigrapher of the group. And this was just before he died. He died in 2012. He published, his name is Manfred Gehrke. And Manfred Gehrke published an article on this, on the paleography, that's all the features of this inscription. And he said that where it fits best paleographically, when you compare it to all the other Egyptian inscriptions, and remember, it's out of context, you can't date it, it doesn't have a date on it, but how do you date it? You compare it to other inscriptions, other ancient Egyptian inscriptions of the time. And when you do that, he said, where it fits perfectly is the reign of Amenhotep II.
Oh.
Right? Bam. Wow. That's really important. I talk about this in my book, in my new book, Origins of the Hebrews. This is one of the more proofs, right? That these are Hebrews. So that being true, that connects to the second Asiatic campaign of Amenhotep II, which is in November of the Exodus year, 1446 BC. And during that campaign, he captures 100,000 slaves. They're all from the Levant, all from Canaan. 3,600 of them are our old friends, Derek, the Apiru equals Habiru, Hebrews. So here's an inscription that many people don't even know about, that was found in a drawer in the Berlin Museum, and now it's published. So yeah, there could be a lot more of these, and that's definitely part of the thing. But the question that you could ask, and I thought you were going to ask, and so I'll ask the question and answer it for you. Here's the question that I thought you would ask. Well, why did it take Gershon Galil so long to find this inscription and translate it and so forth? Was he just, unsure of what he could do with it all these years? I don't know. That's not public information yet. But I'll tell you what, I'm convinced that what he learned from being exposed to the Mount Ebal inscription all of a sudden turned on light bulbs for him, that he then, however he makes that connection to look at this Jerusalem inscription, but it causes him to say, well, maybe there's a connection here, maybe there's a similar theme going on here. He looks more closely at that inscription and he realizes, oh my, most of what we have going on with the Mount Ebal inscription is going on here with the Jerusalem inscription. And so now that Mount Ebal inscription probably helped him to be able to decipher the letters on this Jerusalem inscription. Again, I'm just recreating what I'm assuming to be true. I'm not saying it is factual, but there's a really good chance that's how it worked out.
How will this influence then interpretation of other inscriptions? Getting back to earlier discussion about the reluctance of other scholars to say, yeah, hey, this looks like Hebrew before the form that we recognize now from more modern, more recent inscriptions. Will there be others who might say, hey, you know what, we think we found one over here Similar to the way that the dam kind of broke. And by the way, I did look up her name. It's Professor Mary Schweitzer, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, North Carolina State, who found the blood cells inside the T-Rex leg bone. But once she did that, that kind of opened the doors for others. Is this the door starting to open?
It is, Derek, but the question is, how long is it going to take the scholars standing in the doorway, seeing completely into the room, knowing what's in the room, able to define and describe well what's in the room? How long will it take them to finally acquiesce and scream out uncle and say, don't twist my arm anymore. I understand, I acknowledge, yes, this is Hebrew. So yeah, plenty of evidence, Derek, plenty. You look at my books, the inscriptions that I've published compared to inscriptions that I refer to in my sources that others have published and so forth. You look at all that evidence. You have to be living in denial. There's plenty of evidence out there. The question is, when in the world are you going to acknowledge it? And I don't know, Derek. I don't know. I mean, it's cut and dry. It's time to give in. It's time to call out uncle.
Yeah, well, it's like the old joke: denial's not just a river in Egypt. So a lot of people still there. Doug, your books, Origins of the Hebrews, the world's oldest alphabet, they are on my shelf right over my left shoulder here as part of my reference library. I won't pretend to understand all of it, but I keep going back to them when this material comes up. Where do people get their own copies of your books?
Good question. And at the moment, you can buy both books. They're both in print at the moment. The World's Oldest Alphabet, originally published in 2016, went out of print right when COVID started, so about March of 2020. COVID started in the U.S. at least as a major issue, but it came back into print in December of 2021. So it's in print. Last I looked, my publisher is selling it for $84. That's Carta in Jerusalem, and you have to pay for shipping to get it from Jerusalem to wherever in the world you want it shipped to. I bought a number of copies. I'm selling them for $60 a copy. I still have to pay quite a lot for my copies that I've bought. So I don't make much out of this, but I can make a little bit out of it, and every author should, right? It should make a little bit.
Sure, absolutely.
He or she sells. So I have copies that are for $60. So I while they're in stock, while they're in my garage, I'll be selling them. So anyone who wants one is welcome to buy one. You can buy them on Amazon, of course, too. But Amazon, the cash cow, takes a huge chunk of royalties, as you know. So there's that. Oh, and my other book, The World's Oldest Origins of the Hebrew, 2021, Hebrews. That book you can buy from the publisher, so that's New Creation in Nashville, or you can buy it from Amazon, or there's several distributors who have taken, by consignment, have taken certain copies and they're selling them, such as ABR, Associates for Biblical Research, and
yes.
Tim Mahoney's ministry up in Minnesota, which is Thinking Man Films. So there are places where it can be bought, but you can also buy it from me. And again, I get the best royalty if it's bought directly from me. So I bought copies of that book as well. So I'd be more than happy to sign them for you and send them out to you so you can buy them from me. But let me add one quick note, Derek, and that's in reference to, since you mentioned my book, and in reference to this article we've been talking about, this New Jerusalem inscription. This is satisfying to me, Derek, because when I published my book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, one of the things that in the 15 or so inscriptions, Hebrew inscriptions that I translate in that book, one of the things I point out is that we have inscriptions that that give us the earliest attested use of articles. And I'm not talking about journal articles. I'm talking about the article, the, T-H-E. Hebrew has an equivalent to the H-E, the man, the woman, the city. Well, we find that in this inscription, this Jerusalem inscription. It says governor of the city. And that exact technical term in Hebrew, I'm not giving it to you in Hebrew, but the Hebrew term is used at least twice, maybe three times in the Hebrew scripture. And they're in later historical books. I think in Chronicles or Kings, or right in that vicinity in those books. But the use of the article "the" is in this inscription, and Gershon Galil points this out as an anomaly, that we have the word "the," and it's this actually a seated man hieroglyph that turns into a letter. And so in that inscription, you have this single hieroglyph. It's the single letter that came from a hieroglyph that designates an article. And the two letters after it, it's an ayin, that's an I, E-Y-E, and then a head with a neck on it, and that's the R letter, resh, which comes from the Hebrew word rosh, meaning head. So it says the city, Ha'ir. City. And so the Ha there, Galil says, here we have this unprecedented use of an article in this proto-Canaanite script. Well, again, it's not proto-Canaanite, it's Hebrew. Guess where else, Derek, we have articles? In the very inscriptions that are found in my book. So if you go to my first book and you look up Wadi Ohol 1, Wadi Ohol 2, Sinai 351, Sinai 353, and Sinai 375a, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find Hebrew articles just like we find in this Jerusalem inscription. What does that do for us? The article doesn't exist in Akkadian. It doesn't exist in Aramaean as such. These other languages that could be, what I meant was Ugaritic. That's
Ugaritic, okay.
Doesn't exist in Akkadian, doesn't exist in Ugaritic.
I was going to ask you about that because that's such a so close language. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah, people who try to say Ugaritic is the original language behind the alphabetic script. No, it's not. It's not. Because because the alphabet is used in Ugaritic not with alphabetic letters, but with cuneiform signs, right? So these wedge-shaped signs. So it's not related. And so whatever, and again, we're talking about an inscription that's 1300 or so BC, whatever, that predates the oldest Phoenician inscription, which is around the 10th century BC. It predates the oldest Ugaritic inscription, which doesn't have articles, right? Doesn't have the in any of its words. Predates this. The oldest Ugaritic inscription is like 1230, 1250 BC, somewhere in that range. Well, here we have around 1300, maybe a little earlier BC. And here we have the same alphabetic script that's found in Egypt and in Sinai, where we do have the use of the Hebrew article the, just like I've documented in my book. So this inscription is an affirmation, a confirmation that I'm not just some crazy guy standing out on the street corner yelling for somebody to hear, hoping that somebody will agree with him. Guess what? If you do good work and the right scholarship, eventually the scholarly community is going to catch up to your work. Why? Because time and truth go hand in hand.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you reached out after the publication of this article, because as soon as Sharon and I saw it, we said, okay, we need to ask Doug Petrovich about this, because we knew that Professor Gershon had been connected to the Mount Ebal inscription. We talked about that. We talked about your translation, your paper on the Lachish milk bowl ostracon. This is just more confirmation that, the Hebrews, A, were in the land, and B, could write.
Yes.
Which kind of demolishes the argument that Moses couldn't possibly have written the Pentateuch because the Hebrews didn't have writing back in the day. Well, yeah, they did.
Yeah, and they're using it to harass the Canaanites, just like we read about in the Amarna letters, right?
Yeah. What's hilarious is that, of course, back in the day, they didn't have social media. So when you wanted to post something like this to the wall, you literally had to post it to the wall or carve it into the wall. Doug Petrovich, thanks so much for your time, your expertise. And again, we really appreciate your work. God bless you, brother.
God bless you. Thank you, Derek. Great to be with you.
I'll put links in the show notes to where you can find Doug's books, You can follow him on Twitter as well and get in touch with him through Twitter. If you use that social media site, that's a way to get in touch with him to buy the books directly from Doug. And again, speaking as an author who has books at Amazon, I can attest that Amazon takes the lion's share of the cut when you buy there. So if you can get direct from Doug, that will help him out, help him continue his work and his research. He is kind of standing out there alone in this field, because to this point, most scholars have not yet been willing to admit that, yeah, there are examples of Hebrew writing before about the 8th century BC, 9th century BC, because that confirms the history contained in the Bible, which puts the Hebrews in the land of Canaan in the 15th century, late 15th, early 14th century BC. Now we've got archaeological and epigraphal evidence to back that up. And this is a really exciting time to be alive when this information is now being revealed. Yeah, knowledge will increase. Things have been stored up for the time of the end. I think this is, to some extent, some of that information. So we really appreciate Doug's work and his friendship, and encourage you to follow him and check out his academia page. He, by the way, was featured in Josh Peck's documentary that we talked about on Sci Friday just a couple of weeks ago, Ragnarok, Humanity's Last Stand. I had mentioned in one of the interviews where I sat down with Josh for the documentary, although I didn't know it was going into this documentary, that Doug's paper on the identification of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Amenhotep II, and the fact that his personal protector deity was Resheph, the Canaanite plague god, who was also considered a special protector of chariots and chariot warriors because, as the plague god, he was the gatekeeper to the netherworld, and the chariot is the vehicle that transported the souls of the dead to the netherworld. And so God frees the Israelites by sending a bunch of plagues and then destroying the Pharaoh's chariots. It was also the city of Shechem where God directed Moses and Joshua to go. Well, I'm rabbit trailing, but anyway, the location of Joshua's altar is significant because Shechem was a city that was sacred to the god Resheph, and the Israelites went there right after Jericho and Ai, so that was their first destination after crossing the river. I mentioned that to Josh in the documentary, and Josh, God bless him, went and put a picture of Doug and a scan of the paper in the documentary. So without knowing it, Doug is featured in the documentary Ragnarok, talking about the Israelites and their escape. Doug's research into the history of writing by the Hebrews, the proto-Hebraic script, developed probably by the sons of Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim in the 19th century BC. Groundbreaking stuff, but most scholars looking for tenure and funding are a little bit timid when it comes to making bold claims like that, especially ones that confirm the history of the Bible. Well, we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to listen to this podcast. You can follow us on social media, of course, on Twitter at ViewFromBunker, my personal Twitter account at Derek Gilbert. I do more political stuff and other things there on that Twitter feed. We're on Facebook as well, and all the new social media sites, Truth Social, Gab Me, We Get It Parler, at Derek P. Gilbert. We've got a conference coming up next month, the Dark Secrets, Bright Hopes Conference. I will be speaking along with L.A. Marzulli and Timothy Alberino. Pastor Dave Bryan is hosting. He'll be speaking as well. This will be at the Church of Glad Tidings, in Live Oak, California. Their website, churchofgladtidings.com. And this will be September 15th and 16th. Hope we can see you there. And speaking of Israel, we hope you'll consider joining Sharon and me as we return to the Holy Land next March 19th through 30th of 2023, with an optional 3-day extension over to Jordan. You can find out more at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. Give us a review, a like, if you will, at Facebook. You'll find us at YouTube, of course, our YouTube channel, youtube.com/GilbertHouse. Subscribe, share with your friends. You'll also find us at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Stitcher, of course, wherever, Spotify too, yes, wherever fine podcasts are sold. And our announcer, the inimitable D.C. Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.